module, we're going to continue talking about the classification and naming of plants, with a focus on cultivated plants, as opposed to naturally occurring plants in the wild. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to describe what a cultivar is, describe what a hybrid plant is, describe the main differences between plant trademarks and plant patents, and describe how plant patents protect the intellectual property of the plant breeder. You'll probably remember that in an earlier module, we talked about the International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi and Plants, which sets out the internationally accepted rules by which naturally occurring plants are named, and is administered by the International Association of Plant Taxonomy. Well, a similar set of international rules exists to govern the naming of cultivated plants. These rules are called the International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants, and are also administered by the International Association of Plant Taxonomy. So let's start by taking a look at how the IAPT defines a cultivated plant. In the eyes of the IAPT, a cultivated plant is defined as one whose origin or selection is primarily due to human activity. This human activity could be the selection of a plant from a wild population. It could be the selection of a plant from existing cultivated stock, either in a nursery or a cultivated landscape or in a field. Or it could result from hybridization, either deliberate, accidental, or natural. A cultivated plant, as defined above, is referred to as a cultivar, which is short for cultivated variety. In some cases, it may also be referred to as a cultigen or a cultivar group, but we're not going to cover those terms here, although you should be aware of the terms in case you ever come across them in a book or an article. The breeder or discoverer of a new cultivated plant has the right to give it a cultivar name, which is usually referred to as the cultivar epithet. Rules for cultivar epithets are laid down in the International Code, and here are some of the points that we should be aware of. Cultivar names should be in a living language, so not in Latin. This rule was brought in relatively recently, so you'll probably still come across some plants with Latinized cultivar names. This isn't wrong, it's just that they were named quite a few years ago. A cultivar name must have no more than 10 syllables and 30 letters. All the words in a cultivar epithet start with a capital letter. So Safari Sunset, both words with capital S's, and Wendy's Wish, both words with a capital W. Single, not double, quotation marks are used around the cultivar name. The cultivar epithet isn't written in italics. The species, the genus, and the specific epithet are, but the cultivar name is not italicized. If the plant is a hybrid, you shouldn't include an X before the cultivar name. So we write Arbutus marina, not Arbutus X marina. Copyright or trademark words can't be used as registered cultivar names, and trade designations aren't recognized as cultivar names either, and we'll talk about these later in the presentation. Technically, cultivar names are supposed to be registered with the International Society for Horticultural Science through their affiliated organizations, such as the US National Arboretum. This is intended to avoid confusion and to ensure that a cultivar is only named once. In practice, though, many cultivars aren't registered and there is quite a bit of confusion, as we'll see later. So let's take a look in a little more detail at examples of each of the three ways in which a cultivated plant or cultivar can arise. First, let's look at cultivars that result from selecting a naturally occurring plant in the wild. In the wild, there's a lot of genetic variation in populations of naturally occurring plants, in a similar way to all the genetic variation we see amongst us humans. Sometimes that natural variation might result in a slightly different phenotype that, for example, has a more intensely colored flower or a different growth habit to other plants in that population. Horticulturalists take advantage of these naturally occurring differences by collecting cuttings from a desirable phenotype and propagating it vegetatively, i.e. they clone it. The plant may then be grown on in the nursery for a while to see how it performs. If it performs well, it's given a cultivar name, and the nursery starts marketing the plant through the nursery trade. Here's an example of a cultivar being introduced from the wild. Ceanothus thurciflorus variety griseus, which has the common name Carmel creeper, is an evergreen shrub that's endemic to California and grows in the wild on coastal bluffs in Mendocino, Marin, and Monterey counties. There's a lot of natural variation in the height of Carmel creeper in the wild, from around 2 feet tall to 4 or 5 feet tall. In the early 1950s, a selection of Carmel creeper was made from Monterey County by Mansell van Rensselaer, a well-known Californian horticulturalist and plantsman. His selection was from a plant that grows to just 2 feet tall, produces slightly darker flowers, is particularly floriferous, and has slightly smaller leaves. He called the cultivar Yankee Point, as that was the area that he collected it from. The full cultivar name of this plant is Ceanothus thurciflorus variety griseus, and then in single quotation marks, Yankee Point. And the common name for the plant is Yankee Point Carmel creeper. Another example is Verbena lilacina delamina, which is pictured on the right here. This was introduced by the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and is a cultivar of the subshrub Verbena lilacina. The straight species, Verbena lilacina, is native to San Cedros Island off the coast of Baja California and has a relatively loose, sprawling growth habit and very pale, wishy-washy lavender flowers. The selection, Verbena lilacina delamina, has a more upright, loosely mounding form and much more vividly colored lavender flowers. Now let's look at how a cultivar can arise in a cultivated situation. A cultivar can also result from a selection made from an existing crop of plants in a nursery or in an ornamental or agricultural landscape. For example, a grower might notice that one plant in a crop of seedlings has differently colored foliage to the rest of the crop. Differences in leaf color are caused by mutations and are often referred to as sports. For example, the genes that code for the production of chlorophyll, the green pigment in leaves and stems sometimes, in certain areas of a leaf may mutate and stop producing chlorophyll. This can result in leaves that are variegated or are not green. The grower, once he or she or they have noticed the mutation, can propagate the mutated stem vegetatively, then trial the plant to make sure the mutation is stable. If the plant performs well, it's given a new cultivar name and then introduced to the nursery trade as a new cultivar. Let's look at 3 examples of this. Firstly, Agonis flexuosa Jervis Bay after dark, which is pictured here on the far right. Agonis flexuosa, the straight species, which is pictured on the near right, is a small evergreen tree with a graceful, slightly weeping growth habit. It's native to Australia and has medium green, linear leaves that smell of peppermint when they're bruised. A crop of seedlings of this tree was being grown at Jervis Bay nurseries in Australia, and it was noticed that one of the seedlings had burgundy foliage. The seedling was grown on, then propagated by vegetative methods, and later introduced to the nursery trade under the cultivar name Jervis Bay After Dark, although you'll often see it listed in California nurseries as just Agonis flexuosa After Dark. And we have an example of this plant in the Southern Hemisphere garden at Cabrillo. A second example is the evergreen shrub Coria Winds Wonder, which originated as a sport, so a mutation, on a branch of Coria mannii, which is a hybrid cultivar between Coria pulchella and Coria reflexa. And here's a third example. Ceanothus thyrciflorus variety griseus, Diamond Heights. This was discovered as a sport on a branch of an ornamental planting of Carmel creeper, Ceanothus thyrciflorus variety griseus, in the Diamond Heights district of San Francisco. On the right, you can see photos comparing the brightly variegated foliage of Diamond Heights with the plain but bright green foliage that is typical of this species. The previous 3 slides showed examples of cultivars created by natural mutations. This means that the grower didn't deliberately manipulate the mother plant in any way to cause the mutation. But plant breeders can create new cultivars, though, by deliberately inducing mutations in plants by using irradiation techniques with X-rays or gamma rays. One of the pioneers of radiation techniques in plant breeding was the agronomist and geneticist Louis Stadler at the University of Missouri in the 1920s, who focused on maize and barley. Radiation techniques are now commonly used by plant breeders to amplify or silence genes in order to produce a new plant that has desirable characteristics. So let's look now at cultivars that are arising from hybridization. A hybrid plant is one which contains the genetic material of more than one genotype, and a hybrid can be produced either naturally or deliberately. The goal of deliberate hybridization by plant breeders is to produce plants which have characteristics that are desirable to us humans. For example, the breeders may be looking to create a plant that has differently colored or larger or double flowers. They may be looking to create a smaller plant that has a much more compact growth habit that fits into today's smaller gardens or will do well in a container on a balcony. They may be trying to breed longer shelf life into fruit and vegetable crops. Or they may be looking to breed a tolerance of basic or saline soils into edible crops so that these food crops can be grown on land that isn't currently in cultivation because of its unfavorable soil chemistry. Breeders may also be aiming to breed pest or disease resistance into a plant so that fewer chemicals have to be used. Or they might be wanting to breed heat tolerance into a plant, which, for example, might enable a plant that's native to the Midwest to be marketed in areas like Florida, Arizona, and Southern California. We might be looking for improved flavor in fruits and vegetables, or we might be looking for higher THC or CBD content if we're growing cannabis. Now that we know some of the reasons why breeders might create hybrid cultivars, let's look at some of the ways in which they might do it. Hybrids can be created in several ways. Firstly, we can cross one taxon with another. An interspecific hybrid can be created by taking pollen from one species and placing it on the stigma of a second species. This can be done by plant breeders in a controlled breeding program, or it can also happen naturally by the action of pollinators such as bees. In a controlled breeding program, we know exactly what the parent plants are. For hybrids resulting from natural pollination, we often don't know exactly what the parents are, but can usually make an educated guess based on the plants in the landscape where the hybrid seedling is found, and on the physical characteristics of the hybrid plant. An example of an interspecific hybrid that was naturally created is Salvia amistad, shown on the far right of this slide, which is an interspecific hybrid between Salvia guaranitica and probably Salvia gesneriflora. An intergeneric hybrid can be created by crossing plants in 2 different genera with each other. For example, Fatshedra lizii here, is a hybrid between Fatsia japonica and Hedera helix. Catalpa tashkentensis, pictured here, is a hybrid between Chelopsis linearis and Catalpa bignonioides. Another intergeneric hybrid that we have in the garden at Cabrillo is Chiranthomontodendron lenzii, which is a hybrid between our native Fremontodendron Pacific Sunset and Chiranthodendron pentadactylon. It's worth remembering that the more distantly related two plants are, the less successful a cross is likely to be. And this is why there aren't very many intergeneric hybrids in the nursery trade, and why we always think it's particularly cool when one is bred. Lastly, we can also create infra-specific hybrids. These involve crossing plants within the same species. For example, Japanese plant breeders crossed several phenotypes from different populations of the low-growing evergreen herbaceous perennial Phyla nodiflora, or Lipia, in order to create a cultivar of this plant that is tolerant of basic soils, these are soils with a high pH, and a dense growth habit. The result of their breeding work is actually marketed not under a cultivar name, but under the trademarked name Carapia. In irrigation trials at UC Riverside, where most of the research in California is done on turf grasses, Carapia has been shown to require less irrigation in the summer than many of the commonly used turf grasses in California. And it's increasingly being used by landscape contractors and designers as a lawn substitute in low foot traffic areas. Let's look now at trademarks, plant patents, and marketing names. The nomenclature of cultivated plants has become confusing in recent years, with breeders and growers ignoring the naming rules of the International Code and using patents and trademarks to protect their work. These plants are often given catchy selling names or marketing names that the International Code refers to as trade designations. The International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants only governs the use of cultivar names. It doesn't govern the use of these marketing or selling names. The only rule relating to the use of trade designations in the International Code refers to how these names should be written. And the code states that trade designations must always be distinguished typographically from cultivar epithets. What this means is that you need to write the trade designation in a different font. So, for example, the RHS in the UK uses a different font. Some authorities just use small capitals for this purpose. And the reason for this is so that we can tell the difference between what is a registered cultivar name and a marketing name. Let's look at a well-known example of a trade designation. In 1958, the German rose breeder Reimer Cordes registered a new white rose with the cultivar name Corbin. Instead of being marketed as Rosa Corbin, this white-flowered rose is sold in English-speaking countries under the selling name Iceberg, in France as Fée des Neiges, which means snow fairy, and in Germany as Schneewittchen, which means little white snow. It's understandable that breeders and growers change these trade designation names according to the language of the country in which the plant is being marketed, so that they're more meaningful to the target market. However, some plants have their trade designation name changed even between two English-speaking countries, such as Australia and the US. There's no international database which monitors or keeps track of all the trade designations. Given that many cultivated plants are marketed across the globe, it's really easy for confusion to arise and for consumers and even professionals to think that a plant with different trade designation names is two or more different plants. The confusion is compounded by growers not adhering to the syntax rules of the International Code. In practice, most nurseries and landscape professionals I've seen in Western Europe, the USA, and Canada are pretty sloppy with plant nomenclature and treat trade designations as if they were cultivar names. And this can be really confusing for students, home gardeners, nurseries, and most other plant professionals. Let's turn our attention now to plant patents and trademarks. I know that a lot of this topic is confusing, and we can go over any questions you may have in any of our labs. And you may wonder why we're talking about it, but I think it's really useful to understand the concept of plant patents, trademarks, and plant breeders' rights in the USA for several reasons. Firstly, so that we can understand the labeling, signage, and marketing materials of plants that have these protections. Secondly, so that as propagators, we don't break the law by propagating these plants illegally. Thirdly, so that we're aware that there are legal protections for our intellectual property if we ever breed or discover a new cultivar. And lastly, patents and trademarks are now common practice in the US nursery industry. It's an area which is hotly debated in some circles, and as educated horticultural professionals, we should be aware of this topic. So the USA began granting plant patents in 1930, and under the United States Code 35, Section 161, a plant patent can be granted to someone who invents or discovers and asexually reproduces any distinct and new variety of plant, including cultivated sports, mutants, hybrids, and newly found seedlings, other than a tuber-propagated plant or a plant found in an uncultivated state. Basically, what this is saying is that you can apply for a plant patent for any new and distinct plants, except ones that occur naturally in the wild or ones that are propagated from a tuber. So basically, it's tough luck if you're trying to make a living as a potato or a dahlia breeder. Plant patents are granted for 20 years and are valid from the date the paperwork is accepted by the US Patent and Trademark Office. The cost of obtaining a plant patent is usually at least $10,000 because it's best to hire a lawyer because the paperwork can be quite complicated. Let's look at some of the reasons why growers or breeders might apply for a patent. So the main reason is that growers and breeders want to protect the successful results of their breeding work and recoup their investment in plant breeding. They often grant wholesale growers a license to grow their patented plants, and in return they receive royalties from those growers for each plant that's propagated. The amount of the royalties range in value, but are usually between 10 to 35 cents per plant. So if you estimate that several millions of a particular patented plant are being sold, then those royalties soon add up to a considerable amount of money that the breeder or grower can obtain. Plants patented in the US are identified by the letters USPP, or sometimes just PP, and then the patent number. For example, the photo on the right is of Salvia Wendy's Wish, which has US plant patent number USPP 21889. The Salvia Wendy's Wish was discovered as a chance seedling in the garden of a woman called Wendy Smith in Australia. The plant was patented in 2009 and given the cultivar name Wendy's Wish because instead of keeping the patent royalties for herself, Wendy Smith wanted the royalties to go to the Make-A-Wish charity. Since then, there have been two other related introductions, Salvia Ember's Wish and Salvia Love and Wishes, and the royalties from both of these patented plants also go to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's important to know that patented plants can't be reproduced asexually for commercial gain. Well, they can be patented, but you would be breaking the law. And this is usually stated on the label for any patented plants that are sold in retail nurseries. You can propagate a patented plant for your own use at home, and if the plant produces viable seed, you can collect and grow the seed on. Remember, though, that the resulting offspring won't come true. If you want to propagate and sell a patented plant, you have to request permission from the patent holder, or buy rooted plugs from another grower who is already licensed. Any labeling or marketing materials that you should produce should include the patent number. And you can check to see if a plant is patented or if the patent is still valid by searching in Google Patents or in the US Patent and Trademark Office's database. Once the plant patent has expired at the end of 20 years, then anybody is free to propagate the plant without permission from the patent holder. And now this is where it gets confusing. In recent years, some breeders and growers have started to use trademarks instead of patents to protect their work. Trademarks are valid for 10 years, but unlike patents, can be renewed when they expire. I think there are several reasons why growers and breeders are using trademarks instead of patents. Firstly, registered trademarks, which are denoted by the small r in a little circle symbol, are cheaper to obtain than patents. If you do the paperwork yourself, they cost about $275 to file, or obviously more if you hire a lawyer to draft and file the paperwork for you with the US Patent and Trademark Office. Unregistered trademarks, denoted by the small TM symbol, don't need to be registered, and anybody can put the TM symbol on a product. Some plants don't remain popular for 20 years, so they may not warrant the expense of a patent, which is valid for 20 years. And remember that some plants aren't marketed across the whole country, so they may not sell in sufficient quantities to recoup the expense of applying for a patent. It's interesting to note that unlike patents, you can apply for a trademark name for a naturally occurring plant. For example, some of the plants marketed under the Plant Select brand, which is a collaboration between Colorado State University and the Denver Botanic Garden. Once a patent has expired, some breeders try to continue protecting their use of a plant name by applying for a registered trademark for that previously patented name. In this slide, you can see a copy of the trademark for the name Swan Hill, which is a fruitless olive tree that has been extremely popular as a landscape tree in California since the mid-1970s. This is a tree that was previously patented, and after the patent expired, the nursery has continued to try and protect the name Swan Hill by trademarking these words. And finally, some plants have both a patent and a trademark. This is getting really confusing. An example of this is the Agastaki, pictured on the right. This is Sonoran Sunset, with plant patent number 13673. This plant is patented with the cultivar name Agastaki Kana Sinning. Sinning is the last name of the breeder, but it's marketed under the registered trademark name Agastaki Kana Sonoran Sunset, which of course sounds much more appealing to consumers. But I have no idea why this plant couldn't have been patented in the first place with the name Sonoran Sunset. Let's summarize what we've covered in this module on the naming of cultivated plants. Rules governing the name of cultivated plants are compiled by the International Association of Plant Taxonomy and administered by the International Society for Horticultural Science. The rules are published as a supplement to the main code under the title, The International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants. Cultivars or cultivated varieties can be created in several ways: by selecting a plant with desirable characteristics from the wild, by selecting a plant from a cultivated landscape, by hybridizing a plant, and by deliberately creating mutations. Plant breeders can register a patent for a new cultivar and then receive royalties from other growers who wish to grow that plant, in a similar way to copyright royalties on music. The nomenclature of cultivated plants has become really confusing as a result of growers and breeders using trademarks and marketing names now. And finally, it's useful to have an understanding of these practices used to name cultivated plants so that we can use the correct terminology, avoid propagating a patented plant and consequently being sued, and lastly, so we know that there are ways to protect our plant breeders' rights if we ever discover a new plant ourselves.